everyone for joining us. Welcome to the Washington Outsider geopolitical series. With us today is Mr. Gabriel Noronha. And also joining us later today is Dr. Michelle Al-Harbi. We are here to discuss the situation with Iran and the Yemen war, the regional and international repercussions of Iran's involvement in Yemen, and its policy and its interest in using Yemen as a geostrategic pressure point in the region. We will start with Mr. Noronha, who will give his brief overview about the situation from Iran's perspective as a former special advisor to the State Department on Iran. Hopefully, Dr. Al-Harbi will join us later, and we will continue the discussion with question and answer. And for those who are new to the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Irina. I wanted to start with talking about Iran's strategic calculus in the region and how it pertains to Yemen and their support for the Houthi rebels there. Iran is, for the last several decades, trying to create what it calls a Shia crescent across the Middle East, where it is trying to create a network of friendly governments with Shia majorities in government that will be under Iran's supervision and direction. It's done that successfully in Lebanon with Hezbollah, in Syria with Bashar al-Assad. It tries to do so in Iraq with empowering Shia militias and the popular military forces, the PMF, and it is doing so currently in Yemen with the Houthi forces. Their primary goal is to undermine the sovereign governments, which are typically but not always Sunni governments, and replace them with the Shia governments, but at a minimum to keep the Sunni governments sort of at war and have them be distracted by the conflicts so that they cannot devote their resources either to empowering their own government or to pushing back strongly on Iran. And that is Iran's primary calculus with Yemen. It has no particularly strong allegiance to the Houthi rebels. They're a different type of Shia sect, actually. There's the Shia Fivers and the Shia Twelvers, and so there's actually a different sect among the Houthis. But their primary goal is to undermine Yemen's government and really to put pressure on the Saudi Arabian government, which has long been sort of its rival and an adversary in the Middle East. Over the last few years, Iran's primary support for the Houthi rebels has been on the military side with weapons shipments. And I think we're going to see if the JCPOA negotiations keep going forward and providing Iran with relief, it could make the situation far worse in Yemen, actually, than it is today.
And how do you see that becoming actually worse?
Sorry?
How do you see it becoming worse? What is the potential effect that would?
Sure. So if the JCPOA is sort of successfully renegotiated, Iran is going to get on sort of day one of the agreement, Iran is going to get $90 billion in sanctions relief. And that money is funds that Iran has frozen in foreign currency reserves. So it has, for example, about $8 billion in South Korean banks, another $6 billion in Japanese banks, and lots of cash flowing in and out of Europe and real estate assets around the world. If the JCPOA is returned to, the US sanctions will end providing Iran access to those resources. Now, it's been forced in the last few years to really reduce its support for its terror proxies in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. They just haven't had the money to fund their proxies quite as much as they have in the past. Iran's budget for last year was only $34 billion. So if you give them three times, almost three times their annual budget in sanctions relief, they're going to be able to massively increase their support for their foreign policy, which is generally conducting and supporting terrorist groups such as the Houthis in Yemen. Um, we've already seen in the last in the last several years, really, Iran being very dedicated to providing military support to the Houthis. They provide lots of weapon shipments, some of which the U.S. has been able to interdict as on their way, but not all of them are able to be interdicted. It's also the question is sort of if Iran has $90 billion it didn't expect and didn't have yesterday, could it escalate its financial support for the Houthis as well? I think that's something that policymakers really need to be concerned about.
There's been a couple of interesting developments on the policy side, and I'm curious what you think of that. On the one hand, the administration agreed to release a great deal of the remaining frozen funding, and also apparently pushed South Korea to release at least 1 billion of the funding frozen in those banks over there. On the other hand, the administration also committed to training Yemeni Yemeni army and to work with them to counter child soldier recruitment, Iran's intervention in and other aspects of the war. How is that supposed to work exactly? I'm a little bit confused by this policy, but I may be missing something.
No, you're not the only person that's confused. I think a lot of the countries in the Arab Gulf and the Arab region, the Gulf, are quite confused as well. And it goes back to, I think, the contradictions in President Biden's Middle East strategy, sort of broadly speaking. So on South Korea specifically, so there's been reports over the last 6 months, really, some of which have been true, some of which have turned out to be false, that the Biden administration is allowing sanctions relief to come to South Korea and allow Iran to use some of its funds. It appears that they've now allowed just a very limited number of those funds to be used for what they call humanitarian purchases of food and medicine. But the real issue even there is that when Iran uses those funds, what it's really doing is it's moving money from accounts. The money it would normally have to spend on food and medicine, they now can move to support terrorism because now they have the new funds from South Korea to replace that budget for food and medicine, and that's really concerning. But back to your broader point about, is it helping Iran or is it helping the Yemeni government? It can do both, and it's pretending to do both right now. So it's saying one of the first things that the Biden administration did was it ended the U.S. government support for the Saudi government's military campaign in Yemen. Um, and previously, it had only been really sort of logistical support. We weren't conducting military operations ourselves, but what we were doing is we were trying to teach the Saudi government how to target more accurately so we wouldn't have civilian casualties, trying to improve their human rights practices. And we ended all of that support, which I don't think made things better. But by empowering Iran through the nuclear deal, which has no restrictions on Iran's support for terrorism funding throughout the region, it's really undermining all of the other initiatives that the Biden administration is trying to do throughout the Middle East. So if you're trying to end the war in Yemen, but at the same time you're funding their primary enemy, you're really undoing everything, and it's really unclear what direction Biden wants the Middle East to go. Under President Trump, there were contradictions at times, but you generally saw a very clear direction. It was pro-Israel, it was pro-Saudi, it supported Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Gulf countries, and it was very, very anti-Iran. And so it sort of had this idea of where we want the Middle East to go. We want this to be a world in where Iran is weak and everyone else who is getting along fairly well has the time and space to repair their governments, build strong civil societies. Today, I just don't know what the Biden administration's overarching Middle East policy is, and they haven't articulated it yet.
I'm curious how Iran interprets the following chain of events. involving the administration's engagement with Iran, particularly on Yemen-related matters. First, on the one hand, the administration attempted to negotiate with the Houthis directly with failed results, as we know. On the other hand, Iran has brought in its own ambassador to Sana'a, but as far as I know, the administration has not engaged with him directly, although various humanitarian organizations did. And similarly, there's been a lifting of the sanctions on the Houthis overall and the return to the direct humanitarian assistance to the Houthis. But on the other hand, a number of Houthi leaders have been sanctioned, including over the ongoing Marib offensive. So, how does Iran interpret this policy, especially in light of the ongoing talks in Vienna? And what role, if any, does it play in the overall negotiation scheme?
So it's interesting. The Iranian ambassador, so the sort of their so-called ambassador to Sana, is an IRGC general. So he's not even normally when you appoint a diplomat, they're from the diplomatic corps, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in their case, it's an IRGC brigadier general who is their so-called ambassador. So it's not really about diplomatic ties. It's not really about trying to do negotiations. It's more like sending a military general and then saying their job is to win a military conflict. And I think we've seen time and again that Iran really isn't serious about doing negotiations in Yemen. And to my knowledge, the U.S. envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, who's a great guy, a good friend, is not. I do not believe he is engaging with the Iranians directly, partly because the general is actually a sanctioned individual by the U.S. government, so he's sanctioned for terrorism related reasons. The United States doesn't typically, although sometimes it does, we don't typically negotiate with terrorists or designated terrorists in peace negotiations. So that makes it quite a bit harder. I think, frankly, the peace negotiations and those led by the UN envoy as well have shown nothing. I don't follow Yemen quite as closely as I follow Iran, but from a casual outsider's perspective, you see a lot of statements from the State Department, from the UN, from the Europeans, and that's basically all they are. They're just statements. They don't reflect change on the ground. And in many respects, I think this is another flaw of the Biden administration, is there's an overemphasis on statements, condemnations, and no real action on the ground. And what it does is it really undermines the purpose of having these statements and making these threats if you don't ever follow up. I think that's one lesson the Iranians have learned is you can kind of just ignore what the U.S. says.
Unfortunate, an unfortunate effect, of course, but not particularly surprising. What is more surprising is the fact that IRGC officials are on the ground in Yemen. This individual, the ambassador, is just one of them. There's been rumors that some high-level officials who allegedly died of COVID or other mysterious reasons were actually killed during the offensive in Marib, and Marib is considered to be the last stronghold of the Arab coalition in Yemen. If it falls, the Houthis and others are free to go onward to Aden, as many, I believe, may happen sooner or later. In light of these developments, it's particularly curious that U.S. has discussed lifting the IRGC sanctions with Iran. Do you think that's likely to happen? And if so, what do you think will be the effect of this measure?
So I've heard two conflicting sources. One is from the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, who reported to the Iranian Parliament that the United States was willing or had planned to even lift sanctions on the IRGC, as well as on Iran's whole economy, on the Supreme Leader Khamenei and his office, which would include Foreign Minister Zarif himself, actually. So we've seen that report. And it's available online in English as well for people who are interested in sort of seeing the specifics of what Zarif alleged the United States was willing to give up. But in my private conversations with senior officials in the US government, they've been indicating that that report is not true, that the United States has never actually offered to end sanctions on the IRGC, which I hope is the case, and that would be good. It's important to understand, and this gets a little complicated, but ending sanctions on the IRGC is not easy to do legally in the US system. So there's several classes of sanctions. There are economic sanctions. For example, the US sanctions on Iran's oil sector, its metal sector, petrochemical sector. Those are fairly easy to be lifted. They can kind of do it. If the Biden administration wants to lift them, they can lift them. Then you have individuals who have committed, say, human rights abuses, who have been involved in violent repression. To end those legally, it might be possible, but politically is nearly impossible to prove, to go back to the American people and say, we lifted sanctions on human rights abusers, and have people think that's a good idea. The IRGC is an even more difficult case because the United States sanctioned them as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, when that happened, it was extremely difficult legally to get that sanction on in the first place. The Department of Justice had to approve of it, and sort of your non-political career-appointed lawyers were going through all the evidence to prove that, yes, they are indeed a foreign terrorist organization. They engage in terrorism. And to remove that, you have to have a finding that they have stopped conducting terrorism. And as every single person knows, the IRGC has not stopped conducting terrorism. In fact, it's been doing that ever since its conception. And so I think, even though the Iranians are claiming that the United States will do it, I'm wary that the United States would do so. It'd be almost impossible to sell to the American people and to Congress, and it would be difficult to do legally within the executive branch. So I would take that slightly loosely. Now, the Biden administration did do the same thing with the Houthis. They removed the foreign terrorist organization listing from the Houthis, and that was controversial. But they also sort of did it right. The Trump administration had only made that listing right at the end of the administration. And I'm not sure exactly how they were able to do so legally, but I think they
That's a
had it.
great question, actually. I've been trying to find out from many different people, and no one has been quite able to explain it to me, because it appears to be the exact same sanction as IRGC, and therefore their complicated legal procedures, as I understood it, should be exactly the same.
So it is very similar. Basically, what happened is, to my understanding, is that Secretary Pompeo is, in a sense, the head lawyer of the State Department. And so he can sort of make a legal finding based on certain evidence that the Houthis are and were a foreign terrorist organization. And when the new administration comes in, Secretary Blinken is now the top lawyer for the State Department. And he made a legal finding that the Houthis were no longer a foreign terrorist organization. That was extremely controversial, and it might not have even been 100% legal. But part of it was just as the administration was coming in, and conservatives, and including those in Congress, didn't really have they weren't organized, and they weren't able to legally try to stop it. Whereas now, so even if it wasn't done 100% legally, there was nothing. The Republicans in Congress didn't do anything about it to stop it, and so it just happened.
Well,
If they tried to do that with Iran, it would be a lot more difficult.
so the main point that bothers me about this whole situation is that that Secretary Blinken himself articulated that the Houthis, in fact, were engaging in terrorist operations. He did not claim that legally there was anything issue. In fact, his basis for the finding was not legal; it was humanitarian. It was a humanitarian case that was not, in fact, a legal argument for removing the sanctions. So, in that case, did he not himself basically admit that this is not a legal finding on his part, but a completely different reason for looking at that has no basis even on pro-administration legal reasoning. He could have
Yeah,
said they're not actually terrorists. He did not say that.
yeah, I think you're right, and I think that is one of the many issues. Now, what Blinken could have done, and this is what the United States, what Secretary Pompeo did in many respects, was there was concern about listing them as a terrorist organization initially because of the humanitarian concerns. There was concern that there would be difficulty getting humanitarian aid, food, and medicine into Yemen because so many of the areas are controlled by the Houthis. But what we did was the Treasury Department gave sort of a blanket sanctions waiver where we said, we're not going to sanction anyone that does business here if it's for humanitarian reasons, because we're not trying to penalize people getting food, getting medicine. What Secretary Blinken should have done, and President Biden as well, should have done was simply just continue that policy. You can say they are a terrorist organization, which they are, but we're not going to inhibit the passage of humanitarian goods. We're going to allow the UN to continue doing it. And that's what they should have done. It's important to have moral clarity. If a country or an organization is conducting terrorist activity, they should be called a terrorist organization. If you commit a crime, if you steal from a store, you should be penalized for stealing. Now, maybe you did it to feed your child. Well, then you can address it in the sentencing part of the court hearing. But if you commit a crime, you should be charged with that crime. You can deal with the implications later. And that's, I think, why one of many reasons why the Houthis should have been and should still be a terrorist organization.
Um, that's in fact a really great point. Since then, we've seen several efforts. We've seen actually the Houthis intensify their terrorist attacks on local Yemeni municipalities, on Saudi Arabia, and we have actually seen them potentially attacking UAE externally. So we are seeing. We've also seen that Houthis have extended a helping hand, or at least an offer of that, to Hamas during the recent conflagration with Israel. So we are seeing them becoming a more globalized organization from purely local insurgency to essentially a more integrated part of Iran's network of proxies, partners, and fellow travelers. So, given that its role is expanding from merely trying to get rid of the Yemeni government in Yemen and assert power, to essentially extending its reach throughout the region and facilitating Iran's own goals, what effect does it have on the current U.S. policy, given that it's no longer a local civil internal matter in Yemen, but more of a regional and global matter involving multiple allies and potentially international trade in the region and so forth? What is the position? How does the administration continue justifying pushing for a peaceful solution when this is an organization with the goals that are not limited to asserting power but extend to other things that disrupt international peace?
That's a great question. And I'll start with a story, I guess. Back in September 2019, so it's nearly 2 years ago now, if you remember, there was an attack on the Saudi oil processing facility at Abqaiq on the coast. And right as it happened, the Houthis issued a statement saying that they were the ones responsible, that they had fired the missiles at Saudi Arabia, which was strange because they didn't have the type of missiles that were used in the attack. And it became quite clear that the attack was not coming from the Houthis. It was coming from the mainland in Iran, and there was video footage of the rockets literally coming. If you look at the map, you would see a farmer, for example, see the missile coming along the path all the way to Abqaiq. So it became clear that the Iranians had asked the Houthis to take responsibility and act like they were the ones that did the attack, which shows you that. And the fact that you would admit to attacking, a sovereign nation with an attack that brazen is pretty powerful. And it shows that the fact that they were willing to do so tells you that they were happy to be just another proxy of Iran, and really that Iran was happy to have them take the blame for their actions. just because it was politically convenient at the time. So I think, in response to your broader question, the Houthis, I think, yes, I think they want to control the government, but they're also an ideologically extreme organization that organizations like that are rarely content at stopping. Once they meet a certain objective, they're going to seek another one and another one and another one. And you can't really truly negotiate with groups like that. You can maybe have a temporary agreement, not a ceasefire in this area for such amount of time, but you're never really going to reach a comprehensive agreement that's going to last. Um, and so I think there's this obsession with negotiation and diplomacy, which is good to start with, but you have to realize at a certain point that it's not going to be successful. It hasn't been successful, and pursue other military means. I do not think the Biden administration is going to continue working with Saudi Arabia. I don't think they're going to change anything. They have a really strong desire to leave the Middle East militarily. You've already seen the withdrawals from Afghanistan. There's been some reports of more U.S. troop withdrawals from Iraq. I think we'll see more withdrawing from Saudi Arabia over the next few years as well. So there's no appetite from the United States to do anything. Now, here's my controversial statement. Saudi Arabia is the largest economy in the Middle East. It spends by far the most on military spending. They have a very advanced military. They're getting destroyed by a bunch of ill-equipped poor rebels, and it's pretty irresponsible, and it's pretty pathetic that they can't deal with this on their own. And that leaves to the question of how much support would it take to do it? What is it going to take to really have them, take responsibility and do this for themselves? There's a lot of frustration in the United States about
Well,
this.
I'm going to push back a little bit because if a few years ago I would have to agree with you that it was really quite extraordinary, the disparity between the forces was extraordinarily. Here, I would say that today I think the situation has shifted. I think the Houthis are far better trained that anyone is willing to give them credit for in public, except for Michael Knights, who wrote about over 2 years ago, so almost 3 years ago now, about the growing sophistication of the military and intelligence operations. They have essentially managed to take over most of the country through um, a combination of marital and intelligence networks that are quite sophisticated. They've been trained by Hezbollah and IRGC, which are some of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world, at least with respect to these types of tactical operations. And they own and understand the terrain which Saudis coming from externally do not, which gives them a significant advantage. So I wouldn't say that it's just